There are moments that break the world in two. Moments where everything that came before becomes a different story than everything that comes after. For a young direwolf named Nymeria, that moment came on the banks of the Trident, when the girl she loved more than life itself picked up a stone and threw it at her head. Oh, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Nymeria became, we must first understand what she was. Nymeria was born in the Wolfswood beyond Winterfell, one of 6 pups in a litter that should never have survived. Direwolves had been gone from the 7 kingdoms for centuries, creatures of legend and half-remembered songs. Yet there they were, squirming and mewling in the snow beside their dead mother, waiting to die. They would have died too, if not for Lord Eddard Stark and his children finding them on a summer day that felt like an omen. Arya Stark claimed Nymeria before anyone else could speak. The girl was small and fierce, and entirely certain, and the pup she chose was the same. While the other children selected their wolves with varying degrees of thought and ceremony, Arya simply scooped up the bundle of grey fur and declared her mine. She named her after the warrior queen who had led 10,000 ships to Dawn, and from that first moment, girl and wolf were inseparable. In Winterfell's yard and halls, Nymeria grew. She was not the largest of the litter. That was Grey Wind, but she was quick and clever and bold. She learned the scent of her girl, the sound of her laugh, the taste of her fingers when Arya would sneak her scraps from the high table. The bond between them went deeper than training or loyalty. It was something older, something that ran in Stark blood, like the wolf's blood the Northmen spoke of in whispers. Arya would curl up with Nymeria at night, burying her face in warm fur, telling the wolf secrets she told no one else. How she hated needlework, how she wanted to be a knight, how everyone said she looked like her father, but acted like her aunt Lyanna, whoever that was. Nymeria did not understand the words, but she understood the feeling beneath them, the loneliness, the wildness, the sense of being something that did not quite fit. They were the same, girl and wolf, both smaller than they should be, both quicker than expected, both unwilling to submit. Then came the journey south. Nymeria had never left Winterfell before, had never known anything but the familiar stones and smells of the castle where she was born. The King's Road was a confusion of new scents and sounds, horses everywhere, their nervous whinnying when they caught wind of the direwolves, men in armour who watched the wolves with hands on sword hilts, the smell of the south itself, warmer and stranger with each passing mile. Arya kept Nymeria close. The wolf could sense her girl's unease, the way she drew inward as they travelled farther from home. There were new people here, people who looked at Arya the way they looked at something that should not be. The Princess Myrcella with her perfect manners, the Prince Joffrey with his handsome face and cruel eyes. Even Arya's sister Sansa seemed different here, like she was trying to become someone else. Nymeria stayed at Arya's side, a grey shadow that followed the girl everywhere. At night, she would curl around Arya's sleeping form, a living blanket of fur and warmth and protection. She did not understand courts or kings or the games people played with words. She only understood that her girl needed her. Then came the day at the Trident. Arya and the butcher's boy Micah were playing at swords in a clearing by the river. Nymeria watched them, head tilted, trying to understand this human game of hitting each other with sticks. It seemed pointless, but Arya was happy, and that was enough. Then the prince appeared, Joffrey Baratheon, golden-haired and sneering, with his sword, lion's tooth, gleaming in the afternoon sun. What happened next happened fast. The prince's words, mocking and sharp. Micah's fear, Arya's anger, the butcher's boy running, Joffrey turning his attention and his blade on Arya instead, and Nymeria, acting on instinct older than human memory, launching herself at the threat to her girl. The wolf's jaws closed on the prince's sword arm. She tasted blood, felt flesh give way beneath her teeth. The prince screamed, a high sound of shock and pain, and fell. His precious sword fell into the river with a splash. Nymeria stood over Arya, hackles raised, a growl rumbling in her chest. Every instinct told her to finish what she'd started, to end this threat permanently. But Arya was pulling at her, shouting, dragging her away. They ran. Through the trees, away from the prince's screams and the sound of people coming. They ran until Arya collapsed by the riverbank, sobbing into Nymeria's fur. The wolf licked her girl's face, tasting salt and fear. She did not understand what she had done wrong. She had protected Arya. That was what she was for. For days after, they hid. Arya kept Nymeria close, finding them shelter in the woods while the royal party searched. Nymeria caught rabbits to keep them fed. At night, Arya whispered to her about going home, about running away together, about never going back. The wolf would have followed her anywhere. To the end of the world, if Arya asked it. But on the fourth day, Arya's father found them. Lord Eddard Stark, the man who had brought all 6 pups home to Winterfell, stood in the clearing where they had hidden and told Arya the truth. The queen wanted Nymeria dead. The prince had lied, claiming he was attacked without cause, and now there would be a price. If Nymeria returned, she would be killed. Sansa's wolf lady had already been executed in her place. Innocent blood spilled because Nymeria had run. Arya had sobbed then, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Nymeria pressed against her, whining, trying to comfort her girl. But there was no comfort to be found. That was when Arya made her choice. The choice that broke both their hearts. They walked to the river together one last time. Arya's face was wet with tears, her hands shaking as she buried them in Nymeria's fur. She whispered words the wolf did not understand. Goodbye. I love you. Run. Live. Forget me. Then Arya stepped back, and her whole body changed. Her face hardened. Her hand found a stone. The first stone hit Nymeria's shoulder. The wolf yelped in surprise, in hurt, not from the pain, which was small, but from the betrayal. Her girl had struck her. Arya threw another stone, this one glancing off Nymeria's head. The wolf backed away, confused, whimpering. Why was Arya hurting her? What had she done wrong? Another stone. Another. Arya was screaming now, screaming words that came out like sobs. Get away. Run. Go. Run, you stupid wolf. I hate you. Run. The stones kept coming, and Nymeria finally understood. Her girl was sending her away. Arya was driving her off the way wolves drive away the weak from the pack. But Nymeria was not weak. She was strong and loyal and true. She tried to approach, to press her head against Arya's legs, to show that she would not leave. A stone struck her nose hard enough to draw blood. Arya was crying so hard she could barely see, could barely breathe, but still she threw stones. Still she screamed, "Run! Please run! Just run!" So Nymeria ran. She ran into the woods, her heart breaking with every step. She ran until she could no longer hear Arya's sobs, though she could still feel them somehow, deep in a place that had no name. She ran until the sun set and rose, and set again. She ran until her paws bled and her lungs burned, and still she wanted to turn back. But she did not turn back. Some part of her, the part that was wolf and not human thought, understood what Arya had done. Her girl had sent her away to save her life, to give her a chance to survive when the humans with their swords and their lies came hunting. It was an act of love, though it felt like death. For days, Nymeria wandered alone through the Riverlands. She had never been alone before, not truly. There had always been her littermates at Winterfell, or Arya at her side. Now there was only the endless forest and the distant sound of the river that had changed everything. She was hungry. Direwolves were not meant to fend for themselves so young. In the wild, they would have stayed with their pack for a year or more, learning to hunt, learning to survive. Nymeria had only known the scraps from Winterfell's tables and the occasional supervised hunt in the Godswood. Now she was alone in a strange land with no one to teach her. The first night she went hungry, whining to herself in the dark. The second night she caught a squirrel, more through luck than skill. It was barely a mouthful, nothing like the meat she was used to, but it was something. The third night she found a rabbit warren and managed to dig one out. The rabbit screamed. To dig one out. The rabbit screamed as she killed it, a high sound that reminded her of the prince, and she almost let it go. But hunger won over memory, and she ate. Slowly, painfully, Nymeria learned to be a wolf. She learned which tracks meant food and which meant danger. She learned to listen to the forest, to the whisper of wind through leaves that told of rain coming. She learned to drink from streams and avoid the roads where humans travelled. She learned that she was stronger than she had known, faster than the deer she chased, fiercer than the dogs that sometimes caught her scent and barked challenges they never followed through on. But even as her body grew stronger, even as hunting became easier, and the Riverlands less strange, there was a hollow place inside her that nothing could fill. At night, she would dream of Arya. Dreams where they ran together through snow, where they hunted together in the wolfswood, where Arya's fingers scratched behind her ears and called her good girl. She would wake from these dreams whining, looking around for her girl before remembering. Arya was gone. Arya had sent her away. Arya was beyond her reach now, somewhere in that world of castles and kings that Nymeria could not follow into. Yet the bond remained. Nymeria could feel it sometimes, late at night when the moon was full and her blood ran hot with hunting. She could feel Arya out there, distant but present, like a scent on the wind from very far away. Sometimes the feeling was strong enough that she would turn south, toward where her instinct said her girl had gone, and she would start walking before she caught herself. There was no going back. Arya had made that clear with every stone she threw. Nymeria's life was here now, in these woods, in this wild place where humans feared to walk after dark. The Riverlands were changing. Even a young wolf could sense it. There were more men on the roads now, men in armor carrying sharp steel. There was smoke on the wind from burning villages. There were bodies in the river, bloated and pale, bobbing downstream like grotesque fish. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. War had come to the Riverlands, though Nymeria did not have a word for war. She only knew that the world smelled like blood and fear and death, that the deer were skittish, the rabbits had gone to ground, and the carrion crows circled overhead in numbers she had never seen before. One night, perhaps a month after Arya had driven her away, Nymeria stood on a ridge overlooking the Trident, the same river where everything had changed. The moon was full overhead, painting the water silver. Somewhere far to the south, Arya was sleeping in some castle, dreaming dreams that Nymeria could almost touch. The wolf opened her mouth and howled. It was a sound of loneliness and loss, of a broken bond that still ached like a fresh wound. It was a sound of defiance, too, a declaration that she still lived, still hunted, still remembered. The howl echoed across the water and through the trees, and for a moment the whole world seemed to stop and listen. No answer came back. Nymeria was alone. But down in the valley below, the war was spreading like a sickness, and the Riverlands would soon know her name. The stones Arya had thrown had driven her away from her girl, but they had also set her free. Free to become something the North had not seen in generations. Free to build a legend that would be whispered in fear and wonder for years to come. Nymeria, the direwolf, was alone, but she would not be alone for long. The first wolf Nymeria met tried to kill her. It happened 3 weeks after Arya had driven her away, in a stretch of forest near the Blue Fork, where the trees grew thick, and the undergrowth made travel difficult. Nymeria had killed a young deer, her first truly successful hunt, and was feeding when she caught the scent. Another wolf, male, hungry, and coming closer. She'd never met a wild wolf before. Her littermates at Winterfell had been direwolves like her, larger and stronger than common wolves, touched by something ancient that ran in their blood. This wolf approaching through the brush was something different, smaller than her despite being full grown, scarred across the muzzle, eyes that held nothing but hunger and territorial rage. He came at her with teeth bared and hackles raised, meaning to drive her from her, kill or die trying. Nymeria met his charge head on. The collision sent both wolves tumbling, snapping and snarling, tearing at each other with fangs and claws. The wild wolf was experienced and vicious, fighting with the desperate strength of a creature that had survived harsh winters and harder competition. But Nymeria was larger, stronger, and carried something in her blood that he did not. The fight ended with the wild wolf on his back, Nymeria's jaws around his throat, one squeeze away from death. She could feel his pulse hammering against her tongue, could smell his fear cutting through the aggression. For a long moment she held him there, breathing hard, her own blood dripping from bites he had managed to land on her shoulder and ear. Then she let him go. The wolf scrambled to his feet, confused. In his world, fights ended in death or submission. He had submitted by exposing his throat, and she had not killed him. That made her alpha. That made her pack leader. He lowered his head, ears flat, and waited for her judgment. Nymeria stepped back from the deer carcass. There was more meat here than she could eat, before it spoiled anyway. The wild wolf approached cautiously, watching her, still expecting a trick, or an attack. When none came, he began to feed. Nymeria watched him for a moment, then returned to her own feeding on the other side of the kill. They ate together in silence, the direwolf and the common wolf, and when they were finished, he followed her. She did not understand at first why he stayed. She had no concept of pack dynamics or wolf society beyond what her instincts whispered to her. But the male wolf seemed to understand something she did not. She was alpha, she was strong. She had fed him instead of killing him, which meant she could afford to share, which meant she was successful. In a world of scarce food and harsh competition, that made her worth following. His name, if wolves had names, might have been Scarface for the old wound across his muzzle. He became the first member of Nymeria's pack, though she did not yet know she was building a pack at all. The second wolf found them 4 days later. This one was female, young and lean, with a coat the color of rust. She had been following the scent of Nymeria's kills, tracking the direwolf through the forest, the way scavengers track predators, hoping for scraps. When she finally approached, tail low and posture submissive, Nymeria let her stay. There was a rabbit in the wolf's jaws, an offering, and Nymeria accepted it by sharing another deer kill she had brought down that morning. Scarface growled at the newcomer, but Nymeria snapped at him once, sharp and commanding, and he backed down. The rust-colored female could stay. The pack was growing. Within a month, there were 7 wolves following Nymeria through the Riverlands. Some came alone, drawn by the scent of regular kills and the promise of food. Others came in pairs, mates or siblings who had been hunting together and saw the advantage of joining a larger group. One old female, with grey in her muzzle and wisdom in her eyes, simply appeared one night at their camp and settled down as if she had always been there. Nymeria let her stay. The old wolf knew things, had survived things, and that knowledge would be valuable. Nymeria had not chosen to lead a pack. It had simply happened, the way water flows downhill, following the path of least resistance. She was the largest and strongest. She was the best hunter. She was alpha by nature, if not by intention, and the other wolves recognized it in ways that needed no words or ceremony. And they were hungry, all of them. The Riverlands were at war, though the wolves understood it only as a time when humans moved in large groups and the forest smelled like smoke and blood. The normal game had been disrupted. Deer herds had scattered or been hunted out by the armies that tramped through the countryside. Rabbits stayed in their warrens. Even the fish in the streams seemed fewer, frightened by all the bodies that kept washing downstream. But a pack of 8 wolves could hunt things a lone wolf could not. They brought down a horse that had broken loose from a Lannister baggage train, the animal stumbling through the woods with an arrow in its flank. They cornered a wild boar and killed it despite the beast's tusks and rage. They even learned to work together to drive deer toward waiting pack members, a coordination that came from instinct and practice, rather than any conscious plan. Nymeria led the hunts without meaning to, her size and speed putting her at the front of every chase, her strength allowing her to make the killing bite while the others harried and distracted. The pack ate well under her leadership, better than any of them had eaten alone, and more wolves came. By the time the moon had cycled twice since Arya drove her away, Nymeria's pack numbered 20. They moved through the Riverlands like a grey tide, sleeping in different places each night, hunting across a territory that grew larger as their numbers increased. Common wolves, all of them. None had the size or the ancient blood that Nymeria carried, but together they were formidable, and they looked to the Direwolf as their unquestioned leader. It was around this time that humans started noticing. The first encounter happened near a place called Maidenpool, though Nymeria had no name for it. A group of Frey outriders, 6 men in mail and boiled, leather bearing the twin towers of House Frey, were scouting ahead of a larger force. They had made camp in a clearing, their horses tied to a picket line, a fire burning low as they passed around a skin of wine and complained about the war and their lord and the wretched Riverlands in general. Nymeria and her pack smelled them from a mile away. The scent of horses was what drew them initially. The pack had developed a taste for horse meat, finding it easier to kill than deer and more plentiful thanks to the war. But as they approached through the darkness, moving silent as shadows, Nymeria caught the scent of the men and hesitated. She remembered men, remembered castles and kindness and cruelty in equal measure, remembered Arya most of all. Some part of her wanted to avoid these humans, to circle around and find easier prey. But the horses were right there, and the pack was hungry, and she was alpha. The pack looked to her for decisions, so she made one. The attack came fast and brutal. 20 wolves emerging from the tree line all at once, going straight for the horses. The animals screamed and thrashed, breaking their tethers, trampling through the camp in their panic. The men shouted and scrambled for weapons, but in the chaos and darkness they could barely see what was happening. One horse went down under the weight of 4 wolves. Another broke free and ran, 2 wolves in pursuit. A third kicked out wildly, catching Scarface in the ribs and sending him flying. Then Nymeria was among the horses, larger than any wolf the men had ever seen, her eyes reflecting the firelight like burning coals. One of the Freymen got a good look at her and screamed something about demons and the old gods. Another managed to get his sword drawn, but froze when he saw her size, his training warring with his instinct to run. The pack brought down 2 horses before Nymeria called them off with a howl. It was enough. More than enough. The men were shouting and swinging torches, and there was no point in fighting humans when the pack had what it came for. As quickly as they had appeared, the wolves melted back into the forest, dragging their kills with them. Behind them, the Frey outriders stood in their ruined camp, staring at the darkness where 20 pairs of eyes had gleamed moments before. The man who had gotten the best look at Nymeria was shaking, muttering prayers to the warrior and to the stranger both. That was no normal wolf, he said, his voice unsteady. That was a direwolf, big as a pony, eyes like the 7th hell itself. His companions told him he was drunk, that it was just a large pack of normal wolves, that direwolves were extinct, and he was seeing things in the dark. But he knew what he had seen. And when they returned to the main column and made the report to their captain, the story began to spread. A giant she-wolf leading a massive pack, hunting in the Riverlands, bold enough to attack armed men for their horses. The story grew with each telling, as stories do. Some said the wolf was big as a bear. Others said her eyes glowed red like coals. A few claimed she had the Stark direwolf's grey colouring, and wasn't it strange that the Starks were at war with the Lannisters, and now their wolf was hunting Lannister allies? The smallfolk heard the stories too, 3rd and 4th hand, distorted by fear and superstition. In a tavern near Maidenpool, a serving woman swore her cousin had seen the wolf. In a burned-out village, an old man told his grandchildren about the giant she-wolf that hunted men who hurt the innocent. A septon preaching to refugees claimed it was a demon sent to punish the wicked. A woods witch muttered that the old gods were angry and had sent their beast to remind men who truly ruled the wild places. Nymeria knew none of this. She knew only that the pack had fed, that they were strong and that the hunting was good. She led them deeper into the Riverlands, following the rivers and the forests, avoiding the roads where humans travelled in large groups. The pack grew larger. 25 wolves, 30, 40. Word spread among the wolves themselves somehow, carried on scent and instinct, that there was an alpha worth following, a direwolf who shared her kills and led successful hunts. Wolves came from all directions to join. Not all of them were accepted. Nymeria had standards, though she could not have named them. Wolves that challenged her authority too aggressively were driven off or killed. Wolves that couldn't hunt were left behind. Wolves that showed sickness or weakness were abandoned. It was harsh, but necessary. The pack could only be as strong as its weakest member allowed, and in a time of war and chaos, weakness meant death. By the time autumn began to deepen toward winter, Nymeria's pack numbered over 50 wolves. They were a force unto themselves, a moving shadow in the Riverlands that struck where they pleased and vanished, before organized resistance could form. They killed horses and cattle and sheep, taking what they needed to survive. They avoided humans when possible, but when humans got in the way of hunting, the pack went through them. A Lannister patrol disappeared near the Trident. The men's bodies were found days later, or what the wolves had left of them. A merchant's wagon was overturned on the King's Road, the guards dead, the horses gone. A group of sellswords made the mistake of camping in the pack's territory and woke to find themselves surrounded by eyes gleaming in the dark. They fled without their supplies or their dignity. The stories multiplied. The giant she-wolf with eyes like embers. The demon wolf of the Riverlands. The ghost of House Stark come to take revenge. Some called her a blessing. Others called her a curse. None called her by her true name, because none of the storytellers knew it. But Nymeria knew her name. Arya had given it to her, back in Winterfell, back when the world made sense, and the future stretched out simple and clear. She carried that name in her heart, even though her girl was gone, even though the bond between them was stretched thin as spider silk across the leagues that separated them. Sometimes, late at night, she could still feel Arya out there, still dreamed dreams that were not quite her own, still remembered the warmth of a small hand buried in her fur. The pack did not understand these feelings. They only understood that their alpha was strong and successful and would lead them to food and safety. That was enough for them. It had to be enough for Nymeria too. On a cold night when the first frost touched the ground, Nymeria led her pack to the banks of the Trident, the same river where Joffrey had threatened Arya, the same river where she had tasted a prince's blood, the same river that had changed everything. The pack fanned out along the shore, drinking and resting. Nymeria stood apart, looking at the water flowing past, dark and endless. Something pale was floating downstream. She waded into the shallows and caught it in her jaws. A body, a man, dead for days, bloated and waterlogged. The scent told her he had been a fighter. The wounds told her he had died violently. She dragged the corpse to shore, and the pack gathered around it, curious. They had seen death before, had caused plenty of it themselves, but there was something about the bodies in the river that felt different. These were not kills. These were casualties of something larger, something the wolves could sense but not comprehend. Nymeria released the body and howled. It started low and rose high, carrying across the water and through the trees. The pack joined in, 50 voices raised together in a sound that was part mourning and part challenge. We are here. We endure. We hunt. We survive. In a Frey camp 10 miles north, men crossed themselves and muttered prayers. In a village 5 miles south, a mother pulled her children inside and barred the door. In the godswood of Riverrun, a woods witch smiled and whispered that the old gods had sent their answer to the lion's arrogance. And far to the south, in a place Nymeria could not see or smell or reach, a girl named Arya Stark stirred in her sleep and dreamed of wolves. The pack had grown beyond anything the Riverlands had seen in a living memory. 100 wolves, then 150, then 200. They moved through the forests and along the rivers like a grey army, and wherever they passed, the land remembered. Nymeria had become something more than just a direwolf now. She had become a force of nature, a living legend that grew with each passing moon. At barely 2 years old, she stood taller at the shoulder than any common wolf had a right to be. Her grey fur was thick and healthy despite the hardships of wild living. Her eyes, amber in the daylight, seemed to glow like embers in the dark. And behind her came a host that made grown men reach for their swords and whisper prayers. The pack had developed patterns, rhythms of movement and hunting that came from instinct and practice working together. They ranged across a massive territory now, from the Blue Fork to the Red Fork, from the Trident itself down to the borders of the Blackwater. Nymeria led them not through conscious strategy, but through the simple logic of survival. Where the game was plentiful, they hunted. Where humans gathered in numbers too large to challenge, they avoided. Where opportunity presented itself, they took it. And opportunities were everywhere in the war-torn Riverlands. The War of the Five Kings, though Nymeria had no name for it, had turned the region into a charnel house. Armies marched back and forth across the countryside, burning and looting as they went. Refugees clogged the roads, easy prey for bandits and broken men. Supply trains moved with armed guards that were never quite enough. And everywhere, always, there were bodies. Bodies in the fields. Bodies hanging from trees. Bodies floating in the rivers. The war machine fed itself on human life and left the remains scattered across the landscape like a farmer scattering seed. For a pack of hungry wolves, it was a grim feast that never ended. Nymeria's pack had learned to follow the armies at a distance, the way crows follow battles. Where soldiers went, death followed, and where death went, meat could be found. They had grown bold with success and numbers, striking at targets that lone wolves or small packs would never dare approach. A Lannister supply convoy moving south from the Twins learned this lesson the hard way. 20 wagons of grain and salted meat, guarded by 40 men-at-arms, travelling through the thick forest near the Green Fork. The guards were tired, hungry, and far from home. They had relaxed their watch, assuming that this deep into Lannister-held territory they were safe from human enemies. They had not accounted for wolves. The attack came at dusk, when the convoy had made camp for the night. The horses smelled the pack first, their ears going back, their nostrils flaring with terror. Then the guards heard it. A sound like distant thunder, growing closer, the drumming of 200 paws on hard earth. The guards scrambled for weapons, shouting warnings, forming a ragged defensive line around the wagons. Then the pack burst from the tree line, and the line collapsed. Nymeria led the charge, her size and speed putting her at the front. She went straight for the horses, her jaws closing on a throat, bearing the screaming animal to the ground. Around her the pack swarmed like angry hornets, attacking from every direction at once. Wolves pulled down horses. Wolves tore at wagon wheels. Wolves scattered the guards, who had no chance of holding against such numbers. The men fought bravely enough. Swords flashed, spears thrust. A few wolves fell, bleeding from deep cuts. But there were simply too many of them, coming from too many directions. The guards broke and ran, some on foot, some managing to get onto horses that had not yet been pulled down. They fled into the gathering darkness, leaving their convoy behind, certain they would be pursued and torn apart. But Nymeria called the pack off with a howl. Let them run. Let them carry their fear back to their camps and their lords. The pack had what it came for. 20 wagons worth of food and more horse meat than they could eat in a week. The wolves fell upon the spoils, tearing open sacks of grain they could not digest, but scattering anyway, pulling down smoked hams and salt pork, dragging away entire haunches of beef that had been meant for Lannister soldiers. When they were finished, when every wolf had eaten its fill and more, Nymeria led them back into the forest. Behind them, the convoy was a scene of carnage, dead horses everywhere, wagons overturned or destroyed, food scattered across 100 yards of trampled earth, and not a single human corpse, which somehow made it more disturbing to the men who found the sight the next morning. The captain of the guard survivors made his report to his lord with shaking hands. A pack of wolves, hundreds of them, led by a she-wolf the size of a horse, with eyes that burned like the smith's forge. They had come out of nowhere and destroyed the entire convoy in minutes. His men had fought, but there were too many by far. The Lord did not believe him at first. 200 wolves. Impossible. Wolves did not gather in such numbers. They were territorial and would fight each other before cooperating. But other reports were coming in. A patrol lost near River Run. A hunting party from Harrenhal that never returned. A village on the Blue Fork where the inhabitants swore a wolf pack had saved them from a group of raiders, though that seemed too strange to credit. The stories were spreading faster than the pack itself. In taverns and camps, around cooking fires, and in castle halls, men spoke of the great she-wolf that hunted the Riverlands. Some said she was a demon sent by the old gods to punish the wicked. Others claimed she was the Stark Direwolf, come south for vengeance against those who had betrayed her house. A few insisted she was just a large wolf that fear and darkness had made into something more. But the smallfolk knew better. The smallfolk always knew. In a burned village near the God's Eye, an old woman told a story to anyone who would listen. She had seen the great wolf with her own eyes, had watched from hiding as the beast and her pack pulled down 3 deserters who had been terrorizing the countryside, men who had raped and murdered their way across the Riverlands. The wolves had torn them apart, like they were made of wet parchment, and the old woman swore the big she-wolf had looked right at her afterward, looked at her with intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "You are safe now." In a sept near Maidenpool, a septon preached a different sermon. The wolf was a demon, Needham. said a beast of the seventh hell sent to test the faithful. It killed indiscriminately, brought chaos wherever it went, and proved that the world had fallen into darkness and sin. He called for hunters to band together and destroy the creature before it destroyed them all. In the woods near Acorn Hall, a woods witch spoke to the trees and the streams. The wolf was blessed by the old gods, she whispered. It carried the blood of the first men and the children of the forest in its veins. It was teaching the Southron lords a lesson they had forgotten, that the North remembers, that the old powers are not dead, that the wild places belong to forces older and stronger than any king. Nymeria heard none of these stories, and would not have understood them if she had. She knew only the simple truths of wolf existence. The pack must eat, the pack must be protected, the weak must be driven off, and the strong must lead. These were the laws that governed her world, older than words or kingdoms, or the games that humans played with each other. But she was changing none the less. The responsibility of leading so many wolves, of making decisions that kept them fed and safe, had sharpened something in her mind. She thought in ways that common wolves did not. She planned in her own fashion. She learned from each hunt, each encounter, each mistake. The bond with Arya had awakened something in her that might have slept forever in an ordinary direwolf, and leading the pack had nurtured that awakening into something unique. She had learned, for instance, which humans to avoid and which to attack. Soldiers in large groups were dangerous and rarely worth the risk, but soldiers in small patrols, separated from their companies, were easy prey if the pack was careful. Camps with fires and posted guards required caution. Camps where the men had drunk themselves into stupidity were simple targets. Nymeria could not have explained these distinctions in words, but she understood them in her bones. She had learned the geography of the Riverlands better than many who lived there. Every ford and crossing, every stretch of dense forest, every cave and hollow where the pack could rest, hidden from human eyes. She knew where the deer gathered to drink at dawn. She knew where the fish ran thick in autumn. She knew the old roads and the new ones, the safe paths and the dangerous ones. And she had learned about the bodies in the river. They appeared almost daily now, floating downstream from battles and executions upstream. Some wore armor, some wore rags, some were too bloated to tell what they had been. The pack had grown accustomed to fishing them out, drawn by curiosity more than hunger. The meat was spoiled and foul, not fit for eating, but something compelled Nymeria to drag them to shore anyway. She could not have said why. Perhaps it was some dim memory of Arya and the lessons about honor that the Starks held dear. Perhaps it was instinct, the same instinct that made wolves bury their dead or howl at the moon. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that would make more sense if she could think in human terms. A protest against the waste, a memorial to the fallen, a reminder that these had been living things, before the war ground them to nothing. Whatever the reason, the bodies piled up on the riverbanks where Nymeria dragged them. The pack would stand watch while she pulled corpse after corpse from the water, laying them out on the mud and stone. Sometimes she howled afterward, a long mournful sound that carried across the water. The pack would join in, 200 voices raised in what sounded like mourning, though wolves did not mourn for humans. This behavior, more than anything else, fed the legends. Smallfolk who witnessed it from a distance spoke of the she-wolf that honoured the dead. Soldiers who found the lust-up corpses wondered what kind of beast would do such a thing. Was it a warning? A message? A sign from the gods? No one could say. But the sight of those bodies, carefully arranged on the shore with wolf prints all around, unsettled even hardened men. The pack ranged farther now, confident in their numbers and their alpha's leadership. They crossed into territories that had once belonged to other wolf packs and absorbed or drove off the competition. They hunted in areas where wolves had not been seen in years. They left their mark on the land in ways that would be felt for generations. A village near Seagard woke one morning to find a dozen sheep dead in their pen, killed but not eaten. The villagers blamed raiders at first, until they saw the prints. Wolf prints. Dozens of them, and one set much larger than the rest. The sheep had been killed in a hunting practice, the pack honing its skills on easy targets before moving on to harder prey. The villagers built higher fences and kept fires burning at night, but they all knew the fences wouldn't stop what was out there if it truly wanted in. A group of outlaws who called themselves the Brotherhood Without Banners encountered the pack near High Heart. The outlaws were not evil men, just desperate ones, and they had been hunting a deer when they found themselves surrounded by wolves. The standoff lasted an hour, men with bows drawn, wolves with hackles raised, neither side willing to back down or attack. Then Nymeria stepped into view, and the outlaws understood that this was not a fight they could win. They backed away slowly, leaving the deer, leaving the hunting ground, leaving the territory to the true rulers of the wild places. One of the outlaws, a man called Lem, later swore to his brothers that the big she-wolf had grey fur like smoke and eyes that looked right through him. "She knew we weren't her enemies," he said around the campfire that night. "Knew we were just trying to survive same as her. So she let us go. But make no mistake, she could have ended us any time she wanted." The Brotherhood remembered that encounter, remembered the mercy, if that was what it was. And when they heard stories later of the great she-wolf pulling dead men from the river, they believed that something different was walking the Riverlands, something that was neither entirely beast nor entirely something more. As autumn deepened and the first true cold began to settle over the land, Nymeria led her pack to a ridge overlooking the Trident, the same ridge where she had howled alone so many moons ago, newly separated from Arya, lost and confused and heartbroken. She was none of those things now. She was alpha of the largest wolf pack the Seven Kingdoms had seen in 100 years. She was legend and rumour and whispered fear. She was the queen of the Riverlands, though she had no crown and wanted none. The pack gathered around her on the ridge, 200 strong, a grey tide that covered the hillside. Below them, the Trident flowed on, carrying its burden of bodies and secrets toward the sea. Nymeria raised her head and howled, and the pack answered as one. The sound rolled across the water and through the valleys, a declaration that needed no words. We are here. We endure. We rule these wild places and bow to no one. In her sleep far to the south, Arya Stark thrashed and whimpered. She dreamed of running with the pack, of hunting with her wolf, of a bond that distance and time could not break. She dreamed of pulling bodies from a river and howling at the moon. She dreamed of being wild and free and powerful in ways a girl could never be. And when she woke, She couldn't remember the details, but she knew with absolute certainty that Nymeria was alive, that her wolf was out there somewhere, not just surviving, but thriving. The knowledge settled in her heart like a warm coal, a comfort in the darkness of her world. The bond remained, stretched thin across leagues and months, and all the things that had happened to drive them apart. But there nonetheless. Girl and wolf, wolf and girl, connected by something older than words and stronger than stone. Nymeria did not understand this any better than Arya did. She knew only that sometimes in the night she felt her girl close by, felt Arya's confusion and pain and growing hardness, and she knew that something in her responded to it, grew harder in answer. As Arya learned to kill, so did Nymeria. As Arya learned to survive, so did Nymeria. They were mirrors of each other, separated by distance, but walking parallel paths toward similar destinations. The Queen of the Riverlands stood on her ridge, surrounded by her army of wolves, and looked out over a land torn by war and drowning in blood. She had no plans to stop the war, no desire to take sides. She was a wolf, not a player in human games. But the Riverlands would remember her nonetheless, would speak her name or the names they gave her for years to come. The great she-wolf, the demon of the Trident, the old god's vengeance, the ghost of the Starks. And in the years ahead, when the war moved on and new struggles began, when the land tried to heal from its wounds, the stories would remain. Stories of the wolf that saved some and killed others. Stories of the pack that honored the dead and terrified the living. Stories of Nymeria, though few would know that name, who ruled the wild places when everything else had fallen into chaos. The howling continued long into the night, carrying across the Riverlands like a promise or a threat, depending on who was listening. The Riverlands were dying. Even the wolves could feel it. The land that had once been green and prosperous, fed by a network of rivers and blessed with fertile soil, had become a graveyard. Fields lay fallow and burned. Villages stood empty, their people fled or dead. The forests were full of refugees and broken men, desperate souls who'd lost everything to the war and now survived by taking from others. And everywhere, always, the smell of smoke and death hung in the air like a shroud. Nymeria led her pack through this dying land, navigating a world that grew darker with each passing season. The pack had reached its peak now, nearly 300 wolves strong, a force that could bring down almost anything it set its sights on. But even with such numbers, even with Nymeria's growing cunning and the pack's increasing coordination, survival was becoming harder. The game was largely gone. The deer herds had been hunted out by armies or had fled to safer territories. The wild boar had learned to avoid areas where wolves hunted. Even the rabbits seemed fewer, their populations crashed by the same devastation that had emptied the human towns. The pack was forced to range farther, to take greater risks, to prey on things they would have avoided in better times. They killed cattle from farms that still operated, leaving angry lords to send hunting parties after them. They took sheep from shepherds who could ill afford the loss, creating enemies among the smallfolk who might otherwise have seen them as neutral. They scavenged from battlefields, fighting with crows and dogs over scraps of meat that were barely fit to eat. It was a hard existence, and Nymeria had to work constantly to keep the pack together and fed. But there was another change happening, something stranger and harder to define. The pack had become more than just a collection of wolves following a strong alpha. They had become a presence in the Riverlands, a force that people spoke about and planned around and assigned meaning to. And that meaning was changing how humans interacted with them in ways both helpful and dangerous. There was the night near the Crossroads Inn when a group of raiders descended on a small farmstead. 6 men, deserters from one army or another, looking to take what little the family had before moving on. The farmer had a wife and 3 daughters, and the raiders had intentions beyond simple theft. They were dragging the eldest daughter from the house when the pack arrived. Nymeria had not come to save anyone. The pack had simply been passing through, drawn by the smell of the farm's chickens, and perhaps a pig if they were lucky. But when they emerged from the tree line and saw the scene, when Nymeria caught the scent of fear coming from the women and the scent of cruel hunger coming from the men, something shifted in her mind. She remembered, not clearly, not in words or images that made human sense, but in feelings and impressions. She remembered Arya's fear at the Trident, remembered the prince with his sword and his sneering voice, remembered the instinct that had driven her to attack, to protect, to stop the threat to her girl. These were not her people. This was not Arya. But the pattern was the same. Strong, preying on weak. Cruel, hurting helpless. Wrong, attacking right. The concepts were too complex for a wolf to fully grasp, but Nymeria grasped enough. She howled, and the pack charged. The raiders died quickly and badly. They had swords and knives, but no chance against 300 wolves that came out of the darkness like grey death. The pack tore them apart, and when it was finished, Nymeria stood in the farmyard surrounded by her wolves, blood on her muzzle, while the farmer and his family stared from their doorway in shock and terror and something that might have been gratitude. The farmer's wife whispered a prayer to the old gods. The daughters clutched each other and cried. The farmer himself, a hard man made harder by the war, bowed his head to Nymeria like she was a lord he owed fealty to. The direwolf looked at them for a long moment, these humans who smelled of fear and relief in equal measure, then turned and led her pack back into the forest. The chickens and the pig were left untouched. The story spread like wildfire through the Riverlands. The great she-wolf had saved a family from raiders. The beast had shown mercy, had distinguished between the innocent and the guilty, had acted with purpose and judgment. It was proof, the smallfolk said, that the wolf was sent by the gods, that it hunted the wicked and spared the righteous, that it was more than just an animal. Not everyone believed it, of course. Lords and maesters dismissed it as superstition and coincidence. The wolves had simply been hunting, and the raiders had gotten in the way. Any pattern people saw was just humans assigning meaning to random events, the way they always did with things they did not understand. Wolves were beasts, nothing more, incapable of moral judgment or conscious choice. But the small folk knew what they knew, and more stories came. A merchant travelling the King's Road was set upon by broken men. His guards were killed, his goods stolen, and he was left for dead in a ditch. As the thieves celebrated their take, wolves descended on them. A massive pack led by a she-wolf grey as smoke. The thieves died screaming. The merchant, bleeding and barely conscious, watched from the ditch as the direwolf approached him, sniffed him once, and then walked away, leaving him alive. He crawled to a nearby village and told his story to anyone who would listen. A group of Stark loyalists, refugees fleeing south after Robb Stark's death, were being hunted by Frey soldiers. The Freys had them cornered near the Blue Fork, outnumbered and exhausted, when wolves appeared on the ridge above. The Frey soldiers saw the size of the pack and fled, unwilling to face both armed men and hundreds of wolves. The refugees escaped. Some said it was coincidence. Others said the Stark wolf had come to save the Stark men, that the bond between house and sigil went deeper than anyone knew. A woman in a burned village near Harrenhal swore that the great she-wolf had brought her dead husband's body back from the river. She had been searching for him for days after a battle, and one morning she found him on the shore, laid out carefully, with wolf prints all around. It was a kindness, she said, though she wept to say it. The wolf had let her bury him properly, had given her that closure when the war had taken everything else. Nymeria did none of these things, with human understanding or human intent. She pulled bodies from rivers because some instinct drove her to do it. She attacked some humans and avoided others based on scent and behavior and patterns her wolf mind could recognize, even if it could not articulate them. She led her pack to hunt where prey could be found, and sometimes that brought them into contact with human dramas that were none of their concern. But the stories took on a life of their own. The great she-wolf became a symbol, a touchstone, a legend that people needed in a time when legends were in short supply. To the smallfolk who suffered under the war, she was hope, proof that something in the world still fought for them, still noticed their pain, still punished those who hurt the helpless. To Stark loyalists, she was a remnant of their lost cause, a reminder that the North remembered even when the North had been broken. To the occupying forces, the Freys and Lannisters and their allies, she was a monster and a nuisance that needed to be destroyed. And then came the Red Wedding, and everything changed. Nymeria was miles away when it happened. The pack was hunting near the God's Eye, far from the twins, where Walder Frey betrayed his guest right and murdered Robb Stark and his mother and his army under his own roof. But the news spread through the Riverlands like poison in water, and even the wolves felt the change it brought. The land itself seemed to recoil. The balance that had kept the war more or less contained, that had maintained some semblance of rules and honour even in the midst of chaos, shattered completely. Men who had held back their worst impulses let them loose. Soldiers who had shown restraint became monsters. The war stopped being about causes or kingdoms, and became simply about cruelty and revenge and the joy of inflicting pain. Nymeria felt it in the way humans moved through her territory now. More desperate, more vicious, more broken. The refugees carried a new kind of fear, the kind that came from knowing that nowhere was safe, that honour was dead, that the old rules meant nothing. The soldiers carried a new kind of confidence, the kind that came from knowing they could do anything and face no consequences. And the bodies in the river increased. Dozens every day now. Then scores. Men and women and even children, all thrown into the water after being killed at the twins or hunted down after escaping. The Freys were eliminating anyone who might carry word of what they had done, anyone who might seek revenge, anyone who had ever shown loyalty to House Stark. The pack pulled them from the water, body after body after body. Nymeria dragged them to shore with a fury she did not understand, a rage that went beyond wolf instinct into something almost human. She did not know these dead people, did not know what had happened to them or why. But she knew, in the way wolves know things, that something terrible had occurred, something that violated the natural order, something wrong. The howling that night could be heard for miles. 300 wolves on the banks of the Red Fork, mourning the dead in the only way they knew how. Smallfolk who heard it said the she-wolf knew about the Red Wedding, knew about the betrayal, knew that the Starks were gone and that something precious had been lost. They said you could hear the grief in that howl, the rage, the promise of vengeance. Nymeria knew none of these things in any conscious way. She knew only that Arya was in pain. The bond between them, stretched thin but never broken, carried emotions across the distance. Fear, shock, grief, rage. Loss so profound it felt like dying. Arya was hurting somewhere far away, hurting worse than she had ever hurt before, and Nymeria could do nothing to help her. So she howled, and the pack howled with her. And the Riverlands heard and understood, in their way, that the Queen of the Riverlands was angry. What happened next was not planned or coordinated. Wolves do not plot revenge or wage war with purpose, but the pack's behavior changed nonetheless. They became more aggressive towards certain targets and more protective of others. They hunted Frey soldiers with particular enthusiasm. They avoided harming anyone who wore Stark colours or spoke with northern accents. They pulled every body they could find from the rivers and laid them out on the shores like accusations. A Frey patrol near Seaguard was found torn to pieces, their bodies scattered across a forest clearing. A Lannister supply train was destroyed so thoroughly that the survivors spoke of demons, not wolves. A group of Bolton men hunting for Stark remnants disappeared entirely, leaving only blood and wolf tracks and terror. The smallfolk spoke of vengeance. The she-wolf was hunting the traitors, they said. She was punishing those who had broken guest right and murdered the young wolf. She knew who the enemy was, and she wouldn't stop until they were all dead. It was justice, rough and bloody and wild, but justice nonetheless. A septon in saltpans preached that the wolf was an abomination, a beast that had learned to hate, that killed with purpose rather than instinct, that threatened the very order of civilization. He called for hunters to band together, for lords to offer bounties, for the beast to be destroyed before it destroyed them all. Men were not meant to be prey for animals that could think and plan and remember. In Riverrun, now held by the Freys, Lord Emmon Frey declared that any man who brought him proof of the great she-wolf's death would receive 100 gold dragons and a knighthood. Hunters and sellards and desperate men poured into the region, seeking the legendary beast and the fortune that came with it. Most never found the pack. Those who did rarely survived to tell about it. Nymeria led her pack deeper into the wild places, away from the roads and the castles and the men who hunted them. She was learning, in her way, that humans were more dangerous when they organized. That fame brought hunters. That legend made her a target. The pack needed to be more careful, more selective, more hidden. But they could not hide entirely. They were too many, ranged too far, left too many signs of their passage. And the stories continued to grow. The she-wolf that honoured the dead, the demon that hunted Freys, the ghost of House Stark prowling the Riverlands, the old god's instrument of vengeance, the queen of the Riverlands in truth, ruling over all the wild places that men could not tame. On a cold night 3 months after the Red Wedding, Nymeria stood on a ridge overlooking the twins. She could see the castle in the distance, 2 towers connected by a bridge over the Green Fork. She could smell it too, the concentration of humanity, the smoke and waste and life. Somewhere in there were the men who had done this thing that had hurt Arya so badly, the men who had broken the world. The pack waited behind her, silent and patient. They would follow wherever she led, into battle or away from it, against humans or toward easier prey. They trusted her completely because she had never failed them. But Nymeria did not lead them toward the twins. She was alpha, not fool. The castle was too strong, too well defended, too full of armed men. Taking it would mean the pack's destruction, and she would not waste their lives on a revenge she barely understood. Instead, she turned away, leading them back into the forests and the wild places where they belonged. Let the humans have their castles and their wars and their betrayals. The pack would endure, would survive, would hunt and live and carry on long after the human conflicts had burned themselves out. But the legend would endure too. The Queen of the Riverlands, who had looked upon the castle of traitors and chosen mercy over massacre. Or perhaps not mercy. Perhaps simply wisdom. Perhaps the understanding that some victories were not worth the cost. In her sleep that night, Arya Stark dreamed of standing on a ridge, looking at the twins, feeling a rage that made her want to tear the stones down with her bare hands, and then turning away, because the time was not right, because survival mattered more than revenge, because she had learned that lesson the hard way. Girl and wolf, walking parallel paths, learning parallel lessons, becoming harder and wilder and more dangerous with each passing day. The bond between them might be stretched thin, but it was teaching them both how to survive in a world that wanted them dead. The Riverlands would remember this time as the darkest of the war, the time after the Red Wedding, when hope died and chaos reigned. But they would remember something else too, the great she-wolf that pulled bodies from rivers, the pack that hunted traitors and protected the helpless, the legend of Nymeria, Queen of the Riverlands, who proved that even in the darkest times, even when everything was lost, the wild places still belonged to forces older and stronger than any king. By the time the seasons began their slow turn toward winter, Nymeria's pack had become something unprecedented in the history of the 7 kingdoms. 300 wolves, then 350, then 400. Numbers that should have been impossible, that defied everything Meisters knew about wolf behavior and pack dynamics. Yet, there they were, moving through the Riverlands like a grey tide, rewriting the rules of what wolves could be. The pack was no longer just a collection of individual hunters following a strong alpha. It had become an organism unto itself, a thing with its own rhythms and patterns and ways of existing in the world. They moved in formations that seemed almost military, spread out across miles of territory, but somehow coordinated in their hunting and their movements. When Nymeria called them, they came from every direction, converging like tributaries into a river. When she sent them out, they dispersed into smaller hunting groups that operated with surprising independence before rejoining the whole. Nymeria herself had grown into her full size now, a direwolf in her prime. She stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, larger than any common wolf by half again. Her grey fur was thick and lustrous, despite the hardships of wild living. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that unnerved anyone who met her gaze for too long, and her presence, the sheer force of personality that radiated from her, kept 400 wolves in line through a combination of respect, fear, and something that might have been love, if wolves could feel such things. She had learned much in the years since Arya drove her away. Learned the territories and their boundaries. Learned which humans to avoid and which could be safely attacked. Learned the rhythms of the seasons and where game could be found when it was scarce elsewhere. Learned to think several moves ahead, not with human consciousness, but with wolf cunning sharpened to an edge that humans would have called genius if they had recognized it. The pack's impact on the Riverlands was profound and growing. The deer populations had shifted entirely, abandoning traditional grazing grounds to avoid areas where the pack hunted regularly. Farmers complained that wolves were taking their livestock with increasing boldness. Travellers reported seeing wolf tracks on every road, in every forest, near every river. It was as if the land itself had been reclaimed by something wild and untamable. The ecological changes were obvious to anyone who paid attention. Regions where the pack hunted regularly saw explosions in rabbit and small game populations because the wolves were taking larger prey. Areas the pack avoided became overgrazed as deer concentrated there in unnatural numbers. The very shape of the land was being altered by Nymeria's presence, carved and reshaped by 400 sets of teeth, and the intelligence that guided them. But it was the interactions with humans that made the pack legendary. Stories multiplied with each passing moon, growing stranger and more elaborate with each telling. Some were true, some were exaggerations, some were complete fabrications, but all of them added to the myth of the great she-wolf and her impossible pack. There was the Meister at Riverrun who tried to study the phenomenon scientifically. Septon Maynard was his name, a practical man who believed in observation and evidence rather than superstition. He spent months collecting reports, mapping sightings, trying to understand how such a large pack could exist and what it meant for the region. His conclusions were troubling. The pack, he wrote in his journals, represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between humans and the natural world. For centuries, mankind had pushed the wild things back, claimed the forests and rivers for civilization, made the land safe for settlement and farming. But now something was pushing back. The wolf pack was reclaiming territory, making parts of the Riverlands unsafe for human habitation, forcing people to adapt to their presence rather than the other way around. More disturbing to the Meister was the evidence of intelligence in the pack's behavior. Wolves that seemed to distinguish between targets based on factors beyond simple opportunity. Wolves that worked together in ways that suggested planning and communication beyond normal pack hunting. A leader that seemed to make decisions based on information and judgment rather than pure instinct. It was, he wrote nervously, almost as if the pack had a mind of its own. A singular consciousness distributed across hundreds of bodies but directed by one will. He was not entirely wrong. Nymeria's bond with Arya, though stretched thin by distance, had awakened something in her that normal wolves did not possess. The ability to think in more complex patterns, to remember more clearly, to plan more carefully. It was not human intelligence, would never be human intelligence, but it was something more than animal cunning, and that something made her pack far more dangerous than their numbers alone suggested. The lords of the Riverlands began to take notice. Lord Emanfrey's bounty still stood, 100 gold dragons for the she-wolf's head, but now other houses added their own rewards. Lord Jonas Bracken offered 50 gold for the beast. Lady Mariah Derry promised lands and titles. Even Lord Walder Frey himself, ancient and bitter in his castle at the Twins, declared that the man who killed the demon wolf would have his pick of his granddaughters for a wife and a keep of his own besides. The hunters came in droves. Professional wolf hunters from the north who knew the craft, sellswords looking for easy gold, desperate smallfolk who needed the money more than they feared death, lords with their huntsmen and their hounds. They came with traps and poison and crossbows. They came with fire and steel and determination. And they died in numbers that would have seemed absurd if not for the evidence of their corpses. A hunting party of 20 men from Housepiper set out to kill the she-wolf and never returned. Their bodies were found weeks later, scattered across 3 miles of forest, torn apart by teeth and claws. A famous hunter from the north, named Redbeard, boasted he would have the direwolf's head within a fortnight. They found his head instead, placed carefully on a riverstone like a warning, his body nowhere in sight. The pack learned to recognize hunters by their scent and their behavior, learned to avoid traps and poisons, learned to strike at hunting parties from ambush and fade away before reinforcements could arrive. The wolves paid a price for this education. Dozens died to crossbow bolts and spears and well-placed traps. But there were always more wolves coming to join the pack, drawn by the legend of the invincible Alpha who ruled the Riverlands. And still, Nymeria pulled bodies from the rivers. It had become almost a ritual now, something the pack did regularly in certain territories. They would patrol the riverbanks, and when they found corpses floating downstream, Nymeria would drag them to shore and arrange them carefully on the banks. The pack would stand vigil for a time, and then Nymeria would howl, that long mournful sound that carried for miles. No one understood why she did this. The practical meat said it was simple curiosity or play behavior. The religious said it was proof of the gods working through the beast. The smallfolk said the she-wolf was honoring the dead because she had been raised by humans and still remembered some scrap of human sentiment. Whatever the truth, the sight of those lined-up corpses with wolf tracks all around became one of the most enduring images of the war in the Riverlands. A fisherman named Pates had the strangest encounter with the pack that season. He was checking his nets near the Blue Fork when he heard something massive moving through the water upstream. He froze, certain it was raiders or worse. But what emerged from the current was the great she-wolf herself, dragging a body by its clothing. Part watched from his boat, too terrified to move, as Nymeria pulled the corpse to shore and laid it out carefully. Then she looked directly at him. Their eyes met across 50 feet of water, wolf and man, and Pate later swore that something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that he was no threat. The direwolf held his gaze for what felt like an eternity, then turned and vanished into the forest as silently as she had come. The body, Patey discovered when he worked up the courage to check, was a young woman, northern by her clothing. drowned, not murdered, probably trying to cross the river in the dark. Pate brought her to the nearest sept for proper burial. He told the story to anyone who would listen. The she-wolf had wanted the girl found, had wanted her given proper rights. It was mercy of a sort, he said. Strange mercy from a strange source, but mercy nonetheless. The pack's territory now covered most of the Riverlands, from the Trident in the north to the Blackwater Rush in the south, from the Blue Fork in the west to the Bay of Crabs in the east. Hundreds of square miles where wolves ruled and humans tread carefully. Lords complained to the Iron Throne, but the Iron Throne had larger problems than wolves. The war continued elsewhere, dragging on in its endless cycles of violence and counter-violence. And the Riverlands were left to deal with their wolf problem on their own. Some communities learned to coexist with the pack. They kept their livestock penned at night and their children close after dark. They left offerings at the edge of the forest, haunches of meat and old horses that were going to die anyway, hoping to appease the wolves the way their ancestors had once appeased the old gods. Some of these offerings were taken, some were ignored. There seemed to be no pattern to it, but the communities that made offerings reported fewer attacks, and that was enough to keep the practice going. Other communities tried to fight. They organized militias and built walls and sent out hunting parties. Most of these efforts failed. The pack was too large, too spread out, too difficult to pin down. A militia might chase wolves out of one area only to have them appear in another. Walls kept out individual wolves, but did nothing when 300 attacked at once. Hunting parties might kill a few wolves, but took casualties that villages could not afford. The war of attrition favored the wolves. Human communities needed every able-bodied person for farming and defense against human threats. They could not afford to lose men to wolf hunts. But the pack grew stronger with each victory, each successful hunt, each new wolf that joined their ranks. By autumn, some villages had simply been abandoned. Their inhabitants fled to larger towns where stone walls and numbers provided protection the countryside could not. Nymeria led her pack through this changing landscape with the same instincts that had kept her alive since Arya drove her away. Hunt where hunting was good. Avoid humans in large groups. Strike fast and fade away. Protect the pack above all else. These were the laws she lived by, and they had served her well. But something was changing in her as well. The bond with Arya, though distant, continued to influence her in ways both subtle and profound. Arya was changing in the south, becoming harder and colder and more dangerous. Learning to kill without hesitation, learning to lie and steal and survive by any means necessary, learning to be no one, to shed her identity like a snake sheds skin. And Nymeria was changing in parallel, becoming more than just a wolf, becoming a force, a legend, a symbol. The pack was her identity now, and leading it required more than strength or cunning. It required something approaching wisdom, the ability to know when to fight and when to flee, when to show mercy and when to show fangs, when to be visible and when to be a ghost. On the night when the pack reached 400 strong, Nymeria led them to a hill overlooking the Trident. It was the same hill where she had stood alone so many seasons ago, newly exiled and lost. But she was not alone now. Behind her stood an army, a force that could challenge anything in the Riverlands except the full might of a castle's garrison. The Queen of the Riverlands in truth, ruling over a domain of forest and river and wild places. The pack howled together, 400 voices raised as one. The sound rolled across the water and through the valleys and over the hills. In their keeps and castles, lords heard it and shivered. In their villages and holdfasts, smallfolk heard it and made signs against evil. In their camps and on their roads, travellers heard it and decided to bed down where they were, rather than risk moving through the darkness. But in a place far to the south, too far to possibly hear, a girl named Arya Stark heard it nonetheless. In her dreams, in her blood, in the bond that could not be broken. She heard her wolf's call and knew that Nymeria was alive and strong and wild and free. And for just a moment, in that dream, she was there with her pack, running through the forest with 400 wolves at her back, powerful beyond measure and answerable to no one. When Arya woke, she couldn't remember the details, but she knew that somewhere out there her wolf was queen of all she surveyed, and that knowledge, that certainty, gave her strength for the trials she faced. If Nymeria could survive and thrive in the chaos of the Riverlands, then Arya could survive and thrive in the chaos of her own life. They were the same, girl and wolf, separated by distance but walking the same path, learning the same lessons, becoming the same thing, wild, free, dangerous, unstoppable. So the queen of the Riverlands stood on her hill, surrounded by her army, and looked out over a land that had learned to fear her name. She had no crown, but needed none. She had no throne, but ruled nonetheless. She was Nymeria, and the wild places belonged to her, and the Riverlands would remember. The thing about legends is that they grow in the telling. Each person who repeats a story adds their own details, their own interpretations, their own understanding of what it all means. And in the Riverlands during the war, where truth was scarce and hope was scarcer still, the legend of the great she-wolf grew faster than wildfire and twice as hard to control. By the 4th year of the war, Nymeria had become more story than wolf. Oh, the wolf was real enough. The tracks were real, the kills were real, the bodies pulled from rivers were real. But the creature that people spoke of in taverns and around campfires and in castle halls had taken on a life of its own, separate from the actual direwolf that led an actual pack through the actual forests of the Riverlands. The real Nymeria was dangerous and cunning and impressive. The legendary Nymeria was something else entirely. This chapter of her story is best told through the voices of those who claimed to see her, to know her, to understand what she was and what she meant. Each person saw something different when they looked at the Queen of the Riverlands. Each carried away their own truth, and all of them were right, in their way. All of them were wrong, too. There was Alice, a serving woman at an inn near Maidenpool. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or superstitious nonsense. She'd worked at the inn for 20 years, serving travellers of all kinds, and thought she'd seen everything the world had to offer. Then came the night that changed her mind. A group of soldiers had come to the inn, Frey men by their colours, drunk and loud and looking for trouble. There was a man in the corner, a northerner by his accent, trying to drink quietly and be left alone. He wore no colours and carried no obvious weapons, just a traveller passing through on his way to wherever travellers go when their world has ended. But the Frey soldiers recognized something in him. Maybe the accent, maybe the look in his eyes, maybe just the fact that he was northern and therefore probably a Stark loyalist, and therefore fair game. They started with words, insults about the North, about Robb Stark, about how the young wolf had died squealing like a pig at the twins. The Northerner said nothing, just kept his eyes on his cup and his hands on the table. But the Frey men were not satisfied with silence. They wanted a reaction, wanted an excuse. So they escalated. One of them knocked the Northerner's cup from his hand. Another grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet. A third drew a knife, not to kill, but to threaten, to frighten, to establish who had power here. The Northerner still said nothing, but his eyes went flat and cold, and Alice, watching from behind the bar, knew that men were going to die in her inn tonight, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Then the door crashed open. Alice swore until her dying day that the she-wolf came through that door like smoke given form, grey and massive and moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The Frey soldiers turned, startled, and that was all the time the Northerner needed. His hand came up with a knife they had not seen, and the first soldier went down with steel in his throat. The second soldier raised his sword, but never got to use it, because Nymeria took him by the arm and shook him like a terrier shakes a rat. Bones cracked audibly. The man screamed. The other soldiers ran, out the door, into the night, running for their lives and their horses and anywhere that was not here. The wolf let them go. Instead, she turned to the Northerner, who was breathing hard, knife still in hand, blood on his sleeve. Man and wolf looked at each other for a long moment. Then the Northerner bowed his head, a gesture of respect, and the wolf turned and walked out the door as calmly as she had entered. Alice told this story dozens of times afterward, and every time someone suggested she had been mistaken, that it was just a large dog, or an exaggerated wolf, or a trick of the light, she would get angry in a way she rarely showed. She knew what she saw. The she-wolf had come to save the Northerner because he was Northern, because he was Stark folk, because the wolf knew who her people were and protected them. It was not random. It was not coincidence. It was purpose and intention and proof that the gods had not abandoned the North even when everything else had. Then there was Sergeant Dennett of the Lannister army, a hard man who had fought in 12 battles and thought he feared nothing. He led a patrol of 20 soldiers through the Riverlands on a mission to clear out bandits and broken men who had been harassing supply lines. They were well armed, well trained, and confident in their ability to handle anything they might encounter. Wolves did not concern them. They were soldiers of the crown, and beasts fled from organized steel. They learned otherwise near the Green Fork, 3 days into their patrol. The attack came at dawn, when the mist was still thick over the river, and visibility was poor. One moment the world was quiet, except for the sound of water and birds. The next moment it was full of wolves. Dozens of them, scores of them, coming from every direction at once with teeth and claws and a coordination that should not have been possible. The patrol formed up back to back, spears out, shields locked. They fought well, killed several wolves in the first minute. But there were too many, and they kept coming, wave after wave, testing the defense, looking for weaknesses. Then Dennett saw her. The she-wolf, larger than any wolf had a right to be, circling the fight like a general surveying a battle. She was not attacking. She was watching, waiting. And in that moment, Dennett understood with perfect clarity that the wolf was thinking, planning, deciding whether his patrol was worth the cost to her pack. The wolves pulled back, not in defeat, but in decision. The she-wolf had apparently concluded that the patrol was too strong, too organized, too willing to fight to the death. The cost would be too high. So she called her pack off with a howl, and they faded into the mist like ghosts, leaving the soldiers standing in a circle of their own, dead and wounded. Dennett reported the encounter to his captain with shaking hands. The wolf had been judging them, he said, weighing whether they were worth killing. And she had decided they were not enemies worth the blood it would cost to destroy them. It was not animal behavior. It was military thinking, strategic calculation. The she-wolf was not just a beast. She was a commander leading an army, and they had been lucky that she decided to spare them. His captain laughed at the report and told him to stop drinking, but Dennett knew what he knew. And when he heard later stories of the she-wolf sparing some groups and annihilating others, he understood. She was choosing her targets, judging who deserved death and who deserved mercy based on criteria only she understood. It was terrifying in a way that simple animal predation could never be. There was an outlaw who called himself Red Ralph, a man who had once been a soldier, but had become something worse in the chaos of war. He led a band of broken men who preyed on refugees and smallfolk, taking what they wanted and leaving corpses behind. They were successful for months, avoiding the soldiers and the proper bandits and anyone who might challenge them. They thought themselves clever and strong and untouchable. Then they made camp near the Blue Fork, in a clearing that seemed safe and defensible. They roasted a pig they had stolen from a farm, drank wine they had taken from a merchant, and celebrated another successful day of being terrible human beings. Red Ralph was telling a story about a woman they had killed the week before when the attack came. The pack hit them like a hammer from the gods. No warning, no mercy, just teeth and claws and savage fury. Red Ralph's men died screaming, torn apart before they could even reach for weapons. Red Ralph himself managed to climb a tree, barely, and watched from the branches as wolves dragged his men's bodies into the forest. He stayed in that tree until dawn, too terrified to move, certain that if he came down, the wolves would finish what they had started. When he finally climbed down, his camp was destroyed, and his men were gone. But in the center of the clearing, placed deliberately, was a single wolf dropping, a marker, a message. This territory was claimed. These woods had a new law, and men like Red Ralph were not welcome here. He left the Riverlands the next day and never came back. He told his story in taverns all along the western coast, and people believed him because his fear was genuine and absolute. The she-wolf hunted the wicked, he said. She could smell the sin on a man's soul and punish those who preyed on the weak. She was the old god's vengeance made flesh, and she would not stop until the Riverlands were cleansed of evil or she was dead. But not everyone saw Nymeria as an avenger or a protector. There was Brother Narbut, a septon who travelled the Riverlands trying to bring comfort to the suffering. He was a good man by all accounts, gentle and kind, and genuinely concerned with helping those in need, and he saw the she-wolf as an abomination. He encountered the pack near the Crossroads Inn, or rather, he found evidence of them. A battlefield of sorts, where wolves had brought down a group of travellers. Men and horses alike torn apart with savage efficiency. The Septon said prayers over the bodies and tried to understand what had happened here. These were not bandits or soldiers. They were merchants, small folk, innocent people, just trying to reach safety. Brother Narbut became convinced that the she-wolf was a demon, a creature that killed indiscriminately and spread chaos wherever it went. The stories of its saving people were lies or exaggerations or misunderstandings. The truth was that it was a beast, nothing more, driven by hunger and animal rage. The fact that it led such a large pack only proved that it was unnatural, a violation of the natural order that the gods had established. He preached against the she-wolf. In every village he visited, called for hunters to band together and destroy it, warned that the creature represented a test from the Seven, a challenge to see if humanity would defend civilization against the wild or surrender to chaos and become beasts themselves. Some listened, some organized hunts based on his words. Most of those hunters died. Brother Narbut began to doubt himself after the third hunting party he blessed failed to return. Perhaps the she-wolf was more than he thought. Perhaps it was being protected by forces he did not understand. Or perhaps, and this thought terrified him, perhaps the gods wanted it to live. Perhaps it served some purpose in the divine plan that he was too small and human to comprehend. The uncertainty haunted him until his death 2 years later, never resolved, never understood. Then there was old Nan. Not the old Nan from Winterfell, but another old woman with the same name, a woods witch who lived in a hut near the god's eye and claimed to hear the voices of the trees. People came to her for wisdom and prophecies and healings, and she spoke of the she-wolf with a certainty that brooked no argument. The wolf was blessed, she said, chosen by the old gods to remind the world of older powers and older ways. The first men had lived in harmony with the wild things once, before the Andals came with their 7 gods and their steel. The she-wolf was a bridge to that older time, a reminder that the land belonged to forces deeper and stranger than any kingdom or crown. Old Nan claimed she'd seen the she-wolf in dreams, standing in a godswood with eyes like fire, surrounded by her pack and her power. The old gods spoke through her, Nan said. They showed their displeasure through her actions. They punished the wicked and rewarded the faithful through her teeth and her mercy. To see the she-wolf was to see the old gods themselves, and those who harmed her would face their wrath. Whether old Nan truly believed this or simply understood what people needed to hear, the effect was the same. Her words spread through the small folk like gospel. The she-wolf became sacred in their eyes, a holy creature that must not be harmed. Hunters who killed wolves from the pack found themselves shunned by their communities. Lords who offered bounties found fewer takers. The creature was protected not just by her own strength, but by the faith of thousands who believed she was divine. And what of the truth? What of the actual wolf? The real Nymeria, separate from all these stories and interpretations and beliefs. She was none of these things, and all of them. She was not a conscious avenger or a holy instrument or a demon or a military commander. She was a wolf, albeit an unusual one, leading a pack and trying to survive in a world that had become hostile and strange. The decisions she made were based on wolf logic and wolf needs and the peculiar intelligence that came from her bond with Arya. Sometimes that meant sparing humans who posed no threat. Sometimes it meant killing humans who did. Sometimes it meant pulling bodies from rivers for reasons she herself did not fully understand. But the legends served a purpose beyond truth. They gave people hope, or fear, or faith, or understanding in a time when all of those things were precious and rare. The she-wolf meant something different to everyone who encountered her story, and each meaning was true in its own way. She was a mirror in which the Riverlands saw itself reflected. The chaos, the violence, the occasional mercy, the sense that old rules were breaking down and new ones had not yet formed. On a night when the moon was full and the pack had fed well, Nymeria stood on a hill and looked out over her domain. Somewhere in the distance, people were telling stories about her. Some were true, some were false, some were something in between. She did not know this, and would not have cared if she did. She knew only the simple truths of wolf existence. The pack was strong, the hunting was adequate, the territory was theirs. That was enough. But in the dreams she shared with Arya that night, in the bond that stretched between them like a thread of silver in the darkness, something passed between girl and wolf. An understanding, a recognition. They were both becoming legends now, both becoming more than what they had been. Arya was learning to be no one in Braavos. Nymeria was becoming everyone in the Riverlands, all things to all people. A story that meant whatever the listener needed it to mean. The ghost stories would continue. The legends would grow. And the truth, as always, would be somewhere in the middle, complicated and messy and impossible to reduce to simple narratives. But that was appropriate. Nymeria herself was complicated and messy, and impossible to reduce to anything simple. She was the queen of the Riverlands. And the Riverlands would tell her story for generations to come. Each version different, each version true. There are bonds in this world that transcend distance and time and all the normal rules that govern how creatures relate to one another. The bond between Arya Stark and her direwolf Nymeria was such a bond. Forged in the moment when a small girl claimed a small pup in the snow outside Winterfell, it had grown stronger with each passing season, despite everything that should have broken it. Miles meant nothing to this bond. Years meant nothing. Even death, perhaps, would mean nothing. The bond expressed itself most clearly in dreams. Arya dreamed of running through forests on 4 legs, of hunting with a pack at her back, of tasting blood and feeling the wind in her fur. She dreamed of pulling corpses from rivers and standing on hills while hundreds of voices howled in chorus. She dreamed of being powerful and wild and free in ways a human girl could never be. And when she woke, she carried the dreams with her like precious stones, examining them in quiet moments, trying to understand what they meant. Nymeria dreamed too, though wolves do not dream the way humans do. She dreamed of a girl with a dirty face and grey eyes. She dreamed of warm halls and soft words and the feel of gentle hands on her fur. She dreamed of a connection that went deeper than pack loyalty, something that sang in her blood and pulled at her heart even when she was fully awake. And in those dreams, she was both wolf and something more, seeing through eyes that were not quite her own, feeling emotions that were foreign to wolf understanding. The dreams grew stronger as both girl and wolf grew harder. As Arya learned to kill in the House of Black and White, Nymeria learned to kill in the forests of the Riverlands. As Arya learned to be no one, to shed her identity and become whatever the situation required, Nymeria became everyone, a legend with 1,000 interpretations. They were walking parallel paths toward the same destination, though neither could have said what that destination was. In Braavos, Arya stood before the kindly man and recited the names of people who had wronged her, people she wanted dead. Cersei Lannister, Walder Frey, the Mountain. The list went on and on, a litany of revenge that she whispered like a prayer each night before sleeping. But when she slept, when the dreams came, she was not Arya Stark seeking vengeance. She was a wolf, hunting because wolves hunt. The purity of it, the simplicity, was almost a relief after the complications of human hatred. The kindly man knew about the dreams, of course. He knew everything about his students, all their secrets and weaknesses, and the things that kept them from truly becoming no one. He spoke to Arya about it one morning, after she had woken from a particularly vivid dream, her eyes still wild, her breath still quick. "You are two creatures," he said in his gentle way, "girl and wolf, one here, one far away, but not truly separate, not truly two." Arya said nothing. To speak would be to admit she was still Arya Stark, still tied to her past, still unable to let go of the girl she had been. And that would mean she was failing in her training. The kindly man smiled, understanding her silence. "The wolf makes you strong," he continued, "but it also keeps you chained. Until you let it go, you will never be no one. You will always be the girl who had a wolf, the girl who lost everything, the girl who wants revenge." But Arya could not let it go, did not want to let it go. The bond with Nymeria was the last piece of herself that remained untouched by death and loss and the brutal education she was receiving. In a world where she'd lost her father, her mother, her brothers, her home, and even her name, the wolf was the one thing that was still truly hers, still truly real. So the dreams continued. And in those dreams, Arya learned things that Arya the human girl could never know. She learned that the pack now numbered over 400 wolves, an army of grey shadows that ruled the Riverlands from the rivers to the forests. She learned that they hunted Frey soldiers with particular enthusiasm, as if the wolf somehow knew about the Red Wedding and what it meant. She learned that Nymeria pulled bodies from the water with a regularity that had become ritual, though the wolf herself did not understand why. Most importantly, she learned that Nymeria was alive and strong and thriving. In a world where everyone Arya loved seemed to die or disappear, that knowledge was a light in the darkness. Her wolf had survived. Her wolf had become something magnificent. And through the dreams, through the bond, Arya could share in that magnificence, even while she was trapped in her human skin thousands of miles away. The bond worked both ways. Nymeria felt Arya's presence in her own dreams, though the wolf had no framework for understanding what she felt. There was the girl, far away, but close somehow, learning to hurt and hide and kill, learning to be dangerous in human ways, just as Nymeria was dangerous in wolf ways. The feelings that came through the bond were complex and difficult. Pain and anger and determination, and a coldness that grew deeper with each passing season. Sometimes Nymeria would wake from these dreams and howl, a sound of longing and loss that her pack did not understand but responded to anyway. They would gather around their alpha, offering comfort in the only way wolves knew how, pressing close and whining softly. And Nymeria would lead them on a hunt, channeling the confusing emotions into the simple clarity of the chase. The bond was teaching them both. shaping them in ways neither could fully comprehend. Arya was learning wolf instincts, wolf awareness, wolf ruthlessness. She moved through Braavos with a predator's grace, saw threats before they materialized, struck without hesitation or mercy. The other acolytes noticed. The kindly man noticed. She was becoming the best student the House of Black and White had seen in years. And much of that success came from the wolf that ran through her dreams every night. Nymeria was learning too, though what she learned was harder to define. She was developing a sense of justice that wolves should not possess. An ability to distinguish between different kinds of humans in ways that went beyond simple threat assessment. Some people she killed, some she spared, some she actively protected. And though she could not articulate the criteria she used, they were there, subtle and complex, learned somehow through the bond with a girl who was learning to judge who deserved death. There was a night when the bond grew particularly strong, when the barriers between girl and wolf became thin enough that each could almost touch the other across the vast distance that separated them. Arya was in Braavos, practicing her water dancing in a quiet courtyard. Nymeria was in the Riverlands, leading a hunt through the forests near the Trident. And for one perfect moment, they were both places at once. Arya moved through the sword forms and felt 400 wolves moving with her, responding to her will. Nymeria led the pack and felt human cunning guiding her decisions, human strategy shaping her tactics. Girl became wolf. Wolf became girl. The distinction blurred until it was meaningless, until they were simply one consciousness split between two bodies, hunting in Braavos and the Riverlands simultaneously. Then the moment passed, snapping like an overstretched cord, and they were separate again. But they remembered. They both remembered what it felt like to be complete. Arya sat down hard in the courtyard, breathing fast, her practice sword clattering to the stones. She could still feel the pack around her, could still taste the deer blood on her tongue, could still hear the howling echoing across the Riverlands. It took several minutes for the sensations to fade, for her to fully return to her human body and human awareness. She wanted to go back, wanted to be the wolf again, to be powerful and wild and surrounded by pack. But she was stuck here in this human city, learning human skills for human purposes. The frustration of it made her want to scream. In the Riverlands, Nymeria stood frozen in the middle of the hunt, her pack confused by her sudden stillness. She had felt the girl inside her mind, had sensed Arya's presence more strongly than ever before. For a moment, she'd been in two places, seeing through two sets of eyes, understanding things a wolf should never understand. It was disorienting and wonderful and frightening all at once. The pack waited for her to move, to give the signal to continue the hunt. But Nymeria stood and looked south, toward where her instincts told her Arya was, even though south made no sense because Arya was impossibly far away. The longing she felt was so intense it was almost physical pain. Her girl, her human, the other half of herself. But there was no going to her, no way to cross the distance between Riverlands and Braavos. So Nymeria did what she always did when the longing became too strong. She howled, long and mournful, and full of a yearning that her pack could feel even if they did not understand it. And the pack howled with her, 400 voices raised in sympathy with their alpha's pain. The seasons continued their turn. Winter approached, bringing cold and hardship and new challenges for both girl and wolf. Arya completed her training at the House of Black and White, or came as close to completing it as she ever would. She learned to change her face and her voice and her very identity. She learned to kill with precision and without emotion. She learned to be no one, though the wolf dreams reminded her every night that she would never truly succeed. Nymeria led her pack through the harshest winter the Riverlands had seen in decades. Food became scarce. The weak wolves died or were driven off. The strong grew stronger, leaner, more dangerous. The pack's numbers dropped from 400 to 300 to 250. But those who remained were the best, the most loyal, the most capable. They were the true pack, forged in hardship and bound by more than simple survival instinct. And through it all, the dreams continued. Connection maintained across impossible distance. Girl and wolf, wolf and girl, sharing experiences and emotions and growth. Learning from each other in ways that neither fully understood but both desperately needed. There came a time as Arya prepared to leave Braavos and return to Westeros when she had to make a choice. The kindly man offered her a final chance to become no one completely, to sever all ties to her past, including the bond with her wolf, to be truly free of Arya Stark and everything that name meant. In exchange, she would gain all the knowledge and power the Faceless Men could offer. She refused. Without hesitation, without doubt, she refused. She was Arya Stark of Winterfell, and she had a wolf named Nymeria who ruled the Riverlands. Those were truths she would never surrender, no matter what they cost her. The kindly man had smiled when she refused, as if that was the answer he had wanted all along. "You can never be no one," he said, "because you're already two." Arya left Braavos with a ship and a sword and a list of names that still needed crossing off. She sailed west toward Westeros, toward home, toward a future that was uncertain and dangerous and entirely her own. And every night she dreamed of running through forests with a pack at her back, hunting and howling and free. Nymeria felt the change the moment Arya's ship sailed. The bond thrummed with new energy, with purpose and direction, and the sense of walls coming down. Her girl was coming closer. Not close enough to see or smell or touch, but closer than she had been in years. Moving in the right direction at last. The pack sensed their alpha's excitement and responded to it. They hunted with new vigor. They ranged with new purpose. They prepared, though they did not know what they were preparing for. Something was coming. Something important. The Queen of the Riverlands was waiting for something, and her pack would wait with her. Years would pass before girl and wolf stood in the same space again. Years of blood and war and loss and struggle. But the bond would hold, through everything. Through all the chaos and pain and transformation, the bond would hold, because some things are stronger than distance, or time, or even death itself. Arya Stark sailed toward Westeros with a wolf in her dreams. Nymeria hunted through the Riverlands with a girl in her heart. They were separate, but not divided, different, but the same. Two creatures who were one, waiting for the day when the distance between them would finally close, and they could be whole again. The Riverlands continued to tell stories about the great she-wolf and her massive pack. Some said she was waiting for something. Some said she was protecting something. Some said she was simply being a wolf, doing what wolves do. All of them were right in their own way. But the truth, the deepest truth, was simpler and more profound than any story. The wolf was waiting for her girl, and the girl was coming home. Not yet, not soon, but eventually, inevitably. Because that was another truth, stronger than distance or time. Wolves remember, Starks endure, and some bonds, once forged, can never truly be broken. Nymeria stood on her hill overlooking the Trident and howled into the gathering dark. Across the narrow sea, Arya Stark heard the call in her dreams and smiled without waking. They were apart but together, separate but whole. And the Riverlands, listening to that howl, understood in their bones that something was changing. The war was ending. The seasons were turning. And the Queen of the Riverlands was waiting for her other half to return. The story was not over. It would never be over. Not really. As long as there were Starks in the world and direwolves to run with them, as long as the old bonds held and the old ways remembered, the story would continue. Girl and wolf, wolf and girl, walking parallel paths that would one day converge. The pack settled down for the night, surrounding their alpha with warmth and loyalty and love in the only way wolves knew how to express such things. Nymeria closed her amber eyes and let the dreams take her. Dreams of running, dreams of hunting, dreams of a girl with grey eyes and a dirty face who called her name across impossible distance. Dreams of coming home